So administrative details, anybody that wants access to the Wi-Fi, the Google Guest access point is open. We'll do Q&A, so feel free, for those of you who have read the book and have questions about the book, feel free to get those teed up. Ken will be walking around with a mic, and we do that. We can all hear each other, but for the recording that we're doing, and we'll share with the portfolio later. That way we don't have to repeat the questions. Anything else before we jump in, or shall we get started?
We can get started. Before we get going, I'm assuming most of you haven't read it, because then I can kind of go into some details about what's in it without feeling like I'm being repetitive. Is that okay? Okay, good. Fire away.
Alrighty. Well, thanks everybody for coming. My name is Rick Klau. I'm a partner at Google Ventures. One of the things we're trying out this year, we're going to do more of, are bringing authors in to talk about their book, either the industry that they cover. In a couple of months, we've got a novelist coming who's got a science fiction novel coming out, who's going to talk about the space that he writes about. But very excited to kick this off with Fred, who's written a great book. I took some time over the holidays to read through it. Kind of fascinating when you read a book when you're familiar with about half of the story, right? So for those who haven't read the book, what Dogfight talks about is the inside story of the development of both iOS and the iPhone and Android, both as a platform and eventually as a series of devices, and talks about how earth-shaking those two developments were, how they both influenced each other in some unpredictable ways. And having been at Google for most of the time that Android grew up and then was launched, really fascinating when you see people's names who you used to share office space with, or in the case of Wes Chan, who sits upstairs. So really looking forward to hearing more color from Fred about the book. I've got some questions teed up. Looking forward to hearing questions from those of you in the audience, and really just looking forward to a pretty colorful conversation. So Fred, why don't you start out? This is a space you've covered for a long time. What led you to this as the focal point for the book, and what are some of the key themes that you tease out throughout the story?
Well, thanks for coming, guys. I spent a fair amount of time thinking about, well, let me back up. The book grew out of stories I wrote for Wired in 2008 and 2009 and 2010. It was pretty obvious when the iPhone came out that it was going to be a big deal. Not just because it was a gadget, but because that Steve Jobs had come out with, but because it was very quickly obvious that it was the first pocket computer the first computer that fit in your pocket that actually you'd want to buy. And once, and then when Android came out, it was pretty obvious, maybe at least to me, that not only was there going to be a pretty good competition between the two, but that the friendship that Google and Apple had was going to pretty quickly deteriorate. I think that, and so I took a look at that and thought, well, there's probably a really good story in there. Usually when you get two big companies going at it like that, there's a pretty good backstory. But there was more to it than that. What I started to really realize was that we were witnessing was essentially the PC revolution all over again. That what happened in the early 1980s was essentially replaying itself once again, that we were actually going to have a platform war the way Apple and Microsoft had in the 1980s, and that fight was going to go on for quite some time. And so I thought that there were a lot of different threads just in there that would pull, that were more than a magazine piece could tackle. And then what I started to realize was, as I was using my phone, I started to realize this after the tablet came out, but as I started to use my phone and my tablet to watch TV and baseball and sporting events and other kinds of things, what I came to start to realize was that this really wasn't just a fight about who was going to be king of the hill in high tech, but that this was actually the whole convergence revolution that we'd been talking about for the past 30 years actually starting to happen. That up until then, the devices that actually existed to drive convergence really weren't very good, and that for the first time, actually, we had devices where essentially you could turn the analog world into a series of hyperlinks. So you see something, you're on the bus and you see a billboard for movie X, and all of a sudden you could watch it on your iPhone or your Android phone. And so you added all those things together, and I thought that putting a box around that would be a pretty good way to sort of give people a sense of what was happening right now, but also where the future was going. And so I'm trying to think and then as I kind of dug into it, what I started to come to understand was that there was an even greater purpose to all of this, which is that people don't really understand Silicon Valley at all, even today. And I would say people outside of Silicon Valley look at companies like Google and Apple and Facebook and all the very big companies here with a fair amount of awe and suspicion, no matter how good they are at trying to kind of give people a sense as to how they operate. But I also started to kind of understand that even people inside the Valley didn't really understand how these companies operated. I think that one of the things that we all lose sight of is that Apple and Google and all these companies have just as much trouble getting stuff off the ground as small companies do, maybe even a harder time. And so I kind of thought that all those things made it make sense to kind of pull a book together.
Talk to me a little bit about, if you contrast the two styles, right? So you have Apple. One of the things that fascinated me, that's of course the side of the story I was least familiar with. I had no idea that Steve Jobs had effectively set two divisions in the company at war against each other in the development of what became the iPhone. People were picking sides. There was quite a bit of animosity inside the company where people who were on one team actively disliked the other, quite a bit of infighting. Mm-hmm. Contrasted with a style that I'm more familiar with at Google, which is this creative chaos where people are just encouraged to try things out, see what works, see what sticks against the wall, and then do more of what works and less of what doesn't. Anything in either of those styles that you felt were critical to the success of either of these two platforms? Do you think there are lessons to be learned from either of those styles?
I think there are lessons to be learned from, well, first, I think there are definitely lessons to be learned, but probably not the ones that are maybe the most obvious. For starters, while the politics inside of Apple's a very, very difficult place to work. I don't know what it's like to work now, but certainly while Steve was running it, it was a very, very difficult place to work. People would, it's a deeply political place run by a despot. And I don't know that makes it that much different than many companies, but actually, I think there are more. The point I was trying to make is that I actually think there are more similarities than differences in the way Android was put together and the iPhone was put together or iOS was put together than differences. by that I mean, even though Google is, the company is a very collaborative place, uses creative chaos to kind of allow 1,000 flowers to bloom and to kind of get things, and the 20% time has been responsible for all manner of really interesting projects. The development of the Android software and the whole Android initiative was developed much more the same way that the iOS and iPhone and iPad developed than anything else at Google typically happens. So Android itself, one of the really interesting things and one of the difficult parts about Android, I think, for Google as an organization was that in order for Android to succeed, Andy Rubin effectively had to wall his team off from the rest of Google. Because in order to actually build a consumer product that would meet a deadline, that would be ready on a certain date, that would meet the carriers and other manufacturers' requirements, required an approach to doing business that was almost the antithetical approach to the way the rest of Google operated, where most of Google's success has been driven by the fact that you built a piece of software, you got it to a certain point, and then you threw it over the wall and kind of let the rest of the world mess around with it to sort of iron out all the kinks. Well, when you're building a phone or building phone software, as Android was doing, that doesn't work at all. You actually have to meet deadlines. I mean, if a certain piece of software that Google is developing isn't ready on time, you just wait and you throw it over the wall when it's ready. If the phone software that's going into a phone isn't ready for the Christmas buying season, you might as well not do it for another year in the cell phone business. And so, in some respects, there were more similarities than differences in the way that operated, and so there was a fair amount of tension that I go into in the book about between the part of the organization that Vic Gundotra ran, which was the part that was partnering, the part of Google that was partnering with Apple, and then the part of the organization that Andy Rubin ran, which was the whole organization that was building Android, and they were most definitely in competition with each other for a period of time, and I think that was, it's actually a testament to the way Google is managed and run, that it as an organization was able to handle that kind of tension, because that's the sort of thing that could have messed up the project very easily.
And you talk about the need for Android initially to be run similarly to Apple, but then go on to demonstrate that Android's success in large part has been due to the fact that it's an open platform on which anybody can build, or just about anybody. How do you contrast those two approaches in the App Store, for instance? Apple famously disallowing certain apps from companies, Google and otherwise. Are those two approaches necessary components of the success of each? Could Apple have been more open? Could Android have succeeded copying the Apple playbook? How do you think about those two approaches?
I think that there's actually less to them than people would like to, than a lot of people would like to admit. I feel like I need to be a little careful about how I phrase that, given the walls that I'm inside. But I think that when Android was built, it started out as I truly believe that Andy and the whole team really thought that the whole open part of the platform was indeed something that was going to differentiate them from Apple and the rest of the marketplace. I think what's pretty clear from my reporting is that over time they came to understand that in order to really make Android work, they needed to actually get more and more and more control over it. So if you actually look at sort of the history of the evolution of Android over the course of the past 5 years, yes, it started out as a very, very open platform where Google said, come one, come all, here's our free software, you can do anything you want with it. I think if you look at the way things are today, technically that's true, but as a practical matter, it's less and less and less true. I think that the Nexus devices, buying Motorola, and some of the other things that Google is doing are all efforts to actually move the whole project to be more Apple-like than anything else. Because what people were starting to realize, and this was a real problem, and this remains a problem, but it's actually, Google is actually getting on top of it, is that if you don't exercise a huge amount of control over the software platform, you wind up with a developer ecosystem that is not unified. And I don't want to use the word fragmented because it's become kind of it's become a little bit of a loaded phrase, but it is absolutely true that one of the problems that Android has had and is very conscious of and is dealing with quite successfully is that it's actually is that the number of people who are on the current version of the OS used to be minuscule. I think the number of people, I feel like a year and a half ago, half the Android phones out there were 2 or 3 software upgrades behind. So, that's a little bit like having half the iPhones out there be on iOS 5 instead of iOS 7. And if you talk to developers, they would tell you that it was a huge, huge problem for them. And ultimately, since this is about platforms, keeping developers happy is long-term in everybody's best interest.
So I'm going to shift gears slightly. I think my favorite passage in the book had to do with the glass, right? The conversation, the whole piece where you talk about Steve Jobs seeking out, was it Corning?
Yeah.
Right, in the Gorilla Glass?
Mm-hmm.
So talk a little bit about that. I was fascinated to hear the history of Gorilla Glass, which long predates cell phones.
Right.
But then that is a necessary component of what became the iPhone, and now a staple on seemingly every device.
Right. The story about the glass is one of those great about the glass screen on the iPhone is one of those great sort of accidents of that make innovation in Silicon Valley so fascinating and interesting. And one of the things that sort of demonstrates to me sort of the power of having an entrepreneur like Jobs running the show. So there was a huge discussion when the iPhone was being designed about what the screen was going to be, what material the screen was going to be. Was it going to be plexiglass? Was it going to be glass? And they had long conversations. This is a year and a half before the phone shipped about the pros and cons of each. And ultimately what they concluded was that it needed to be plexiglass because you couldn't actually put glass on a phone because everybody was going to drop it. And you couldn't actually have a phone where the screen actually shattered every time somebody dropped the phone.
Thank God that never happens.
And so the whole production process was set up for the next year to manufacture the phone with a plexiglass screen. One day, Steve Jobs is walking around with one of the prototype phones. He pulls it out of his pocket and notices that the screen is scratched. The key's in his pocket. His phone is in the pocket. His keys were in the pocket. His keys scratched the plexiglass screen. Walks into the Monday meeting that they had every week and said, "We gotta change the screen." Well, it turned into something of a, he wound up yelling a little bit because there were some minor objections from his staff, and initially you would kind of go, well, why wouldn't you just do what Steve Jobs said? And the reason was because Steve was in having this conversation with them, I think, in about September or October of 2006. So 2.5 or 3 months before Steve Jobs was going to show the iPhone to the world, he said to his staff, we need to change the material that the screen for the phone is going to be. And in fact, the phone that Steve unveiled to the world still had a plexiglass screen. And during the 6 months between the time that the phone was unveiled and the time that actually went for sale, among the many things that they did, they actually switched out the screen. Well, that was in and of itself a huge innovation. So there's a story about how Steve picks up the phone and calls the head of Corning Glass and says, "This is Steve Jobs. I want to try to kind of do this and that and the next thing," and they won't put him through because the person on the at the switchboard thinks that the person on the other end of the line is joking because nobody picks up the phone and calls the switchboard for Corning and says, "I'm Steve Jobs." Now, this doesn't come from my reporting. This comes from out of Walter Isaacson's book. But ultimately, Steve convinced the head of Corning Glass that not only did he have a product, a material that Steve Jobs wanted for the phone, a kind of glass, but that the CEO of Corning could actually convince his manufacturing team to make enough of it for the first shipment of iPhones in something like 2 months, some incredibly short period of time. Well, sure enough, one of my sadnesses in reporting the book is that I didn't get a chance to go to Asia and talk to some of the people who were on the front lines of that decision, because that would have made for 2 or 3 chapters of the book on its own. But reporting is an inexact science, and you take what you can get sometimes. But I think that there's an amazing story there.
And did he know that Corning had developed this material like 50 years ago?
I don't think he did. No. I don't think he did at all. I think that he knew. I think that he knew that he wanted it to be glass, and he needed it not to shatter. And he left it up to Jeff Williams and the rest of the sort of production team to figure that out. But yeah, the glass was ultimately the glass that they chose was glass that Corning developed, I think, in the Korean War for fighter pilot for fighter jets, for the cockpits of fighter jets. And for whatever reason, it ultimately was never used. But so this was actually the first application of this kind of glass formula that had been sitting around on a shelf for 50 years.
Just amazing. All right, let's talk about Android.
Okay.
So you talk about when you shift gears from the very dramatic. If you haven't read the book yet, I got to say the chapters about the months leading up to the iPhone launch, right? The demo, right?
Right.
At Macworld when Steve Jobs gets up on stage, and I think we all had the impression that it was a polished, ready-to-ship device, and you make pretty clear that it was anything but. But at the same time, Android was well underway by that point, and it was underway not because Google was afraid of Apple coming out with something. It becomes clear in what you report that there was real fear here in Mountain View that Windows was going to own the mobile market and was going to lock Google out.
Yep.
That clearly has not proven to be the case,
Right.
to put it mildly. How far back do you have to rewind the clock to get to a fork in the road where Microsoft could have done something different and been relevant in this discussion today?
Well, let me back up. I mean, before I go there, I want to try to kind of give you guys sort of some sense of what Rick was talking about when he said that the iPhone, when it was unveiled, looked like you could buy it in a store, but was nowhere near that. To give you some sense as to the kind of pressure and tension that the team was under, Andy Grignon, who now runs Quake Labs, but who was the engineer in charge of all the radios at the time, said he and all the engineers that were working on getting the iPhone ready for launch were so nervous about the demo failing that they were sitting in the fifth row doing shots of scotch. And you know, what he took me through and what he and others sort of took me through was the story of real human, of a bunch of people, a bunch of mortals trying to make an immortal device, and running into all manner of issues that would never have occurred to any of us, but when you actually see them, you actually start to understand just what an accomplishment it was. I mean, to give you a for instance, the Wi-Fi antenna on the iPhone prototype worked so badly and so unreliably that they actually soldered antenna wire to the phone and then ran it out off stage so that it would connect. The cell phone itself was like so unreliable that they hard coded it to always show 5 bars. Because they knew that the phone call that Steve was going to make during the demonstration would probably work, but they also knew that during the 90 minutes that the phone was up on the screen, the phone would probably crash once or twice, and they didn't want the world sort of seeing the bars going from 5 to 4 to 3 to 2 to 1 and then back up again. And so one of the things that I think we all forget as laymen and entrepreneurs is that building this stuff is incredibly hard, for whether or not you're Apple or Google or just a startup, and that the innovation process is, no matter whether or not you're a little company or an enormous company with enormous resources, is not linear whatsoever. That even though everybody likes to kind of make it seem linear, even at the biggest companies, it's not linear in any way, shape, or form. But to answer the question directly about Microsoft, Google was working on Android starting as early as 2005 when Larry bought Andy Rubin's company. And in fact, actually had a phone that looked like a BlackBerry that they'd planned to unveil September, October of 2007, but had to actually push a year once the iPhone came out. But the thing about, what people forget and what Rick pointed out is that Apple and Google in 2006 were friends. Not only friends, but not only business partners, but close personal friends. I mean, Larry and Sergey and Steve Jobs were socialized together. Eric Schmidt sat on Apple's board. And the foundation of this partnership was that remember, this is 2005, 2006, both companies were still desperately worried about Microsoft, which is hard to believe now, but in 2005, Apple and Google were worried that Windows Mobile, which Microsoft had been trying to get off the ground for like 4 or 5 years, was actually starting to get some traction. And both companies, having fought Microsoft at various points over the previous decades, and I guess I would include Eric Schmidt in this in his previous life at Sun and at Novell, they both felt like that if Microsoft's Windows Mobile business actually got some traction, that could be an enormous problem for Google as a business, because while there were all sorts of rules and regulations about what Microsoft could do on the desktop with its browser, it had to offer choice of search engines, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it actually couldn't leverage its Windows monopoly on the desktop to mess up Google's business, for example. There were no such rules about what it could or couldn't do on the mobile platform, where it didn't have a monopoly at all. And so what Google was desperately worried about was that it would essentially is that Microsoft would wind up getting some traction in Windows Mobile, and then start cutting Google off from its advertising customers that way. And so both Apple and Google teamed up thinking that like the enemy was Microsoft. And it took about 1.5 years, but by the end of 2007, it was pretty clear to the folks at Google that Microsoft was not the one that they needed to worry about.
I want to pause. We have a mic. Who's got questions in the room about what we've been talking about a separate topic? Okay, we'll come up here, maybe right here, and then there you go.
Hey, Graham Hancock. I work at Google Ventures upstairs. So
Hey.
I read the book over the holidays, and in a couple of days, I just couldn't put it down. It was just all of the new information was so interesting to me, especially the iPhone presentation about how it was all kind of chewing gum and baling wire. I think that's that. And I went and rewatched the keynote, the iPhone introduction keynote, with that in mind, and it's a much more interesting experience. Like after having seen it, and just to know that in the background or in the fifth row, there's people doing shots after each demo. It was incredible. But to me, I think the thing I came away with was at the point in the book when there's this sense that there's a growing distrust between the two companies. And I honed in on the fact that Steve Jobs seemed so trusting of Google during that time. He's like, they wouldn't screw us, they wouldn't do this. And he sort of, to his detriment, kept playing that line, saying, I trust them, they won't do something to hurt our relationship. And it turns out that's exactly what was going on. Android was exactly what they had feared it would be. And I think that just colored my perception of him a little bit, just that he was that trusting. And what did you find when you were interviewing people for the book that they were saying about, well, do they think that he was being a little naive, or do they think that was just sort of his core a trait of himself, that he would be trusting of his business partners like that?
I think it was a comment. I mean, like all human emotions, it was first of all, I don't know because I didn't talk to him. But I've talked to a lot of people, and we talked a lot about this exact point. And it wound up being sort of a multifaceted, the answer winds up being multifaceted. The first part is that I think he really did believe that Larry and Sergey were his friends and wouldn't screw him in that way. And I think that, like all CEOs, I think Steve felt like he was a really good judge of character. And so it's very, very, if you believe that you're a very good judge of character, and if you have proven over the years that you are such a good are such a good judge of character that you've built this mega corporation of people around you, you are probably going to maybe be a little bit slower to kind of doubt yourself. But the other thing that I think that needs to kind of get factored into the mix is that he was a lot sicker during all of this than I think any of us knew at the time. I'm trying to remember, remember during 2008, so the iPhone is unveiled in 2007, it comes out in the middle of 2007, Android shows up at the end of 2007, and at the beginning of 2008, Steve starts to get sick. He starts to really get sick. I mean, it's quite clear from reading Walter Isaacson's book that he was sick all along. But, 2008, we all remember, was when, in the middle of 2008, I think all of us remember, was when he was on stage and looked like he had lost 40 pounds. And that was when Apple, I think, said that he had been suffering from a common bug. But it was really obvious that something was wrong, and I think all of us, didn't believe that. I think all of us didn't believe that his cancer had come back, but I think it was really quite obvious that something was up. That was, and so I guess the answer is, if you want my opinion, I think because he was a lot sicker than we all thought he was, I think that probably made him a little bit slower to move than he might have. There's another aspect to this too, though. Apple and Google were not only intertwined from a friendship perspective, their boards were also completely intertwined. So Al Gore is on Apple's board. He's a very close advisor to Google. I'm blanking on, Bill Campbell was on the board and Steve Jobs' best friend. He's a very close advisor to Google. I mean, there were a whole bunch of very, very important, powerful executives who effectively were on the same board, who were essentially on the board of Apple and on the board of Google. And I think that even if Jobs had personally felt betrayed, it was going to be difficult for him to quickly do something about it because it wasn't just his call.
We had another question over here.
Hey there. I have a couple questions for you. They're both related. My first question is, with these two large companies, one of which is, known for its secrecy, Apple, how did you get this type of information out of them? Did you have any official access, if any? And do you think a lot of the information you're able to get and the people you're able to encounter, was that in large part because of your background as a journalist?
I think that, trying to think about where to start. I probably talked to about 100, more than 100 people for the book. Apple, I didn't have any official access from Apple, which probably won't surprise you. Although I did tell them about the book at every step of the way. And I had some access at Google. I talked to Alan Eustace a little bit. I talked to Eric a little bit. I talked to Vic Gondotra a little bit. I didn't talk to Andy directly for the book, but I had done a piece about Android right before I started writing the book, so I kind of didn't need to, almost. And then, but most of the information I got to drive the story came from interviewing people who were really on the front lines of working on these projects. One of the things that I've sort of discovered as a journalist, and maybe this sort of answers your question about sort of the background as a journalist being useful, is that while it's important to get the official view from a company, the official on-the-record view from a company about what happened, it's usually about less than 10% of, if it's more than 10% of what's driving your story, you're relying on it too much. And that isn't to say that companies lie or cheat or steal. It's just that every company wants to put its best foot forward. Every company wants to, therefore, you would expect every company to, in their on-the-record comments, give you a very scripted picture of what's going on, when the reality is that, any organization of human beings are filled with ups and downs and back and forths. And so I guess I spent a fair amount of time, so I really wanted to kind of talk to the people on the ground who were actually experiencing this. Now, the follow-up question to that is, why did I think that these people would actually talk to me? And what I ultimately concluded was that Android, the creation of the Android phones and the Android ecosystem and the creation of the iPhone and the iPad changed the course of history. And all these people were an integral part of it. And part of being a really good soldier at all these organizations is working your ass off and letting all the guys at the top take all the credit for it. But that doesn't mean that you like that. And so I thought that if framed correctly, I could get to enough people who would want to talk about sort of their own personal experience being at the center of this enormous change, because they worked 80 hours a week for 3 years of their life and messed up their health and their marriage and didn't see their kids. And every one of the people who worked on these projects made enormous sacrifices to actually get it done. And while there's certainly a lot of people who are totally content to be silent about that, human nature being what it is, you run into some people who actually would like the world to know. So I guess that's sort of a long-winded answer to your question, but
Thank you.
sorry.
Do we have it right here, next row, right behind you.
Thanks. I'm curious about the when Apple acquired Siri. If what did the two teams? Why did they do that? What did the two teams think about the Siri-like technology, and how important was it really, and how important is it going to be going forward for these platforms?
I don't know. How's that? It didn't come up. I can guess, but that would I could guess, which is that I think everybody understands that. I think both Google and Apple believe that voice to text or voice instructions are going to be a critical part of how how we interact with all these devices going forward. And so I'm sure that was what Apple was thinking when it wanted to get involved there. But I don't know about the deliberations specifically. It didn't come up in the conversations I was talking about. I mean, my own thought is, this is a really good question for me to ask you guys. Do all you guys think that we're going to only interact with our devices by talking to them, or I'm not 25, and so I never try. I'm always careful when a new idea and a new way of interacting with systems comes along that everybody says is really cool. I'm always careful not to sort of poo-poo it, but do you guys like to talk to your machines?
I've got the Moto X, and the voice interaction is great, but I find that the touch interaction is a hard habit to break. That it's just, it feels more natural. It's what I'm used to. So it's always the primary. I have to remind myself.
Well, this is the thing.
Yeah, I can talk to it.
But that's my habit, and that's your habit, and so I guess what I was asking was whether or not that's just a habit, or whether or not that's just a habit, or whether or not that's the result of the fact that it's really not a good enough experience yet for us to change the way we're doing things.
We grew up in science fiction where you're always talking to the computer, right?
Yes.
In all the shows.
I know.
Star Wars and Star Trek and everything, but I think it's sort of a fool's gold in the real world interaction for the most part. My wife laughs at me every night when I tell Siri to set an alarm, and that's about the only thing that I talk to my phone for. Everything else, is like.
I have talked to Siri when I'm lost somewhere and I need to find a pharmacy and I don't want to crash.
But on the other hand, with glass and these less, where there's less touch opportunity,
Yeah.
Something else needs to take its place.
Well, I mean, in my car, I've had several interactions with, specifically with the Moto X, where it has the driving mode it will automatically shift into, and it will read text messages to me. So over the car stereo, I'm hearing text messages as they come in, read to me over the stereo, and then prompts me for a response, which has been a really great way, without my hands ever leaving the wheel, without my eyes ever leaving the road, that I can have entire conversations by text message. That's been great. But I think to your point, they're contextual, they're specific to the mode and the moment. I have a hard time believing that my only interaction will be by voice, because there are times when I'm in a crowd and I don't want to be broadcasting to the world what it is I'm in the middle of doing.
Right, and I'm not so in love with the sound of my own voice that I actually want to that I actually always want to hear it.
Right.
mean, actually, the one that I really want is where the old Star Trek where they could actually push a couple of buttons and food would come out.
Yeah.
That remains a goal. I mean, that's a laudable scientific goal. I mean, like, put microwaves out of business. It's like push a couple of buttons and out comes like hot, burritos.
I've got one more question I'd like to ask, but I want to make sure we've got maybe 5 minutes left. Other questions here in the audience? Here and then maybe right there.
I was just going to add into the conversation based on voice and touch. I almost think that voice and touch are going to replace, how we interact with the computer now, where, we were so used to a mouse and keyboard for so many years and keyboard before that. Now we have the option to touch. So we're going to have an option of touchscreen or voice. And I think going forward, when new technologies come out, when Google Glass gets a little bit more consumer friendly, and when we have watches that Apple might come out with, or the one that Samsung come out with, how are you going to interact with a tiny thing on your wrist? It's going to be voice. And I almost think that Siri is going to evolve into almost being like your personal assistant, even more than she is now. I know Apple actually a few months ago bought a company called Q that was basically like a personal assistant app. And I just have to hazard that the same way that they bought Siri to integrate into the next platform, they're going to do the same thing. They're just going to continue to build on that.
I think I don't disagree. I don't disagree with you, but what I think needs to happen is that the reliability has. I mean, I think what the marketing people would tell you about voice, about things like Siri and Google Voice and all that stuff and Google Voice is so much better than Siri. But the point about just voice recognition is that, well, it's 99% accurate. But in order for us to trust it, actually, I mean, it needs to be like 5 nines. I mean, it has to be 99.9999% accurate in order for us to actually completely trust that it's going to work every single time. Because even 5 nines of reliability, somebody who worked for eBay once told me that like 5 nines of reliability is still like hours of downtime every year, which is, the same thing with handwriting recognition, right? Yeah, I guess it's not handwriting recognition, but optical character recognition. Whenever you see on the box where it says 99% accurate, that's about 24 typos in the course of a page. Well, in the course of a 250-word page full of, 24 typos is that's a mess.
Yeah. One more question back here.
Yeah, so really quick, kind of going to Android, how aware were they of what the iPhone was going to be, and how did that kind of affect like the later releases of Android? Because I'm assuming that there was some, I'm sure they kind of had an idea what the iPhone was going to be for a little bit, but like you said, they were going to release like the Black Parallel device. How did the actual like release affect that first release of Android?
Actually, there's the whole second chapter is a little bit of the book is about no, it's totally fine. I mean,
It's great and really dramatic.
But
I love it.
But the answer is hugely. I actually don't think that the folks on Android, everybody knew that Apple was working on a phone. Nobody on the Android team actually knew what the phone looked like. When they saw what the phone looked like, it forced them to completely change the their whole plan of attack, and it partly explains why Android came out in 2008 instead of 2000. Why the first phone came out in 2008 and not 2007. Because they actually had a phone that they were going to release in 2007 and very quickly realized that while the software would be superior, the phone itself was not well designed enough or not cutting edge enough for it to be successful, and so they had to reboot.
So maybe a good way to conclude this, there was some news this week. Google bought a Google Ventures portfolio company, Nest.
It's the ultimate round trip, isn't it?
Yeah, and if I have to imagine if you know, as the book transitions from the origin stories for both Android and the iPhone into what this means as the industry moves ahead, and you spend some time speculating about convergence of entertainment, Hollywood, television, gaming. I have to imagine that if the book were coming out like this summer, one of the final pieces that would frame some of that final speculation is what it means that Google bought Nest. Of course, Tony Fadell has quite a prominent role in the first half of the book in the origin of the iPhone. What are your thoughts? What do you think it means from your role, having researched this book, knowing what you know about Tony, knowing what you know about Larry and Sergey? What does this mean for where things head for Google, for Apple, for that matter?
It means, actually, only a handful of people have hit this point hard, but I'm going to hit it really hard right here. I think that Google buying Nest is probably it's certainly the biggest decision that Larry Page has made as CEO. It may be one of the bigger strategic decisions that Google as a corporation has ever made. It's certainly, in my mind, more important than buying Motorola, even though it's a third the price. I say all that because what Rick sort of flicked at, but which I'm going to hit even harder, is that Nest is not only run by Tony Fadell, who helped conceive and design the iPod, and then grew that into Apple's largest business until he helped build and conceive the iPhone. But Nest has, all you have to do is look on LinkedIn. Half of Nest's staff all used to work at Apple. So there's a reason, and it's quite obvious from looking at Nest's success, that Tony really understands how to design, build, market, and sell products, consumer electronics to consumers. I mean, like a year ago, they were selling 50,000 units a month. So I imagine that that's probably closer to 100,000. I mean, you know, this is a company that's 3 years old, and in 3 years they're selling like close to 100,000 thermostats a month to people. I mean, that's bananas. It's also something that nobody inside Google knows how to do. And Google has tried, but the DNA of the corporation is not organized around that kind of mindset. In fact, Rick and I were talking before this all started. There's a story that maybe you guys have heard, but I'll repeat it anyway. When Google was first starting out, I think it was one of the members of the board, commissioned a bunch of very, very fancy marketing consultants to develop a marketing plan for how Larry and Sergey were going to get their word out about Google, the search engine, and whatnot. And one of the people on the consulting team was Sergio Zyman, who had been the former head of marketing at Coke. I mean, it was a very high-powered group of people. They came in to present to Larry and Sergey, and they both looked at it and said, "This is the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. Why do we want to spend money on marketing? The internet will allow if our product is really, really good, and we think it is, word of mouth on the internet will convince people to use it. The fact that it's free, especially, will allow people to use it. Proved to be one of the more prescient decisions that Larry and Sergey have made in the time that they've been running the company. But it also confirmed for them their belief that marketing and sales was a complete waste of time. And Google has been run enormously successfully with that whole point of view. Now, as the world sort of evolves beyond just software through the browser, but into apps that run on devices, whether or not they be phones or whatever, wind up on our wrist or in our ear or up our, never mind. Understanding how to sell, understanding how to manufacture, market, sell, design devices for that people actually want to give you money for is a skill that Google really needs to have and to master. Tony is the first person. Tony, I think, is the only person, maybe besides Steve Jobs, that Larry and Sergey respect enough on that particular topic to actually go, okay, this doesn't make any sense to us, but you're so good at it, why don't you take it? Why don't you take it? And so now Tony works for Google, and I think it's going to be really, really interesting to see how that materializes, because that DNA is going to start to filter through Google's whole approach to selling products. And so I suspect you will not see very many Nexus Qs, Chromebooks, even the Nexus One, which was well designed, just badly sold. I mean, Google TVs coming out of Google. What I mean is, you're probably not going to see too many consumer product flops coming out of Google from here on in. And so I think that's, if I'm Tim Cook at Apple, I'm paying very, very close attention to this.
Well, on that note, for those in the room, please do pick up your copies of the book. As Graham said, I couldn't put it down once I started. Thrilled to have had Fred's time shed a lot more light on a number of topics that are covered in the book. I predict you'll all find it as engaging and intriguing as we did. Fred, thank you again for taking the time. Really appreciate you having me out.
Thank you all.
Subscribe to the YouTube channel, Google Ventures on YouTube, gv.com/library for this and other videos. We look forward to seeing you again soon.
No matter how good they are at trying to kind of give people a sense as to how they operate. But I also started to kind of understand that even people inside the Valley didn't really understand how these companies operated. I think that one of the things that we all lose sight of is that Apple and Google and all these companies have just as much trouble getting stuff off the ground as small companies do, maybe even a harder time. And so I kind of thought that all those things made it make sense to kind of pull a book together.
Talk to me a little bit about, if you contrast the two styles, right? So you have Apple. One of the things that fascinated me, that's of course the side of the story I was least familiar with. I had no idea that Steve Jobs had effectively set two divisions in the company at war against each other in the development of what became the iPhone. People were picking sides. There was quite a bit of animosity inside the company where people who were on one team actively disliked the other, quite a bit of infighting. Contrasted with a style that I'm more familiar with at Google, which is this creative chaos where people are just encouraged to try things out, see what works, see what sticks against the wall, and then do more of what works and less of what doesn't. Anything in either of those styles that you felt were critical to the success of either of these two platforms? Do you think there are So administrative details, anybody that wants access to the Wi-Fi, the Google Guest access point is open. We'll do Q&A, so feel free, for those of you who have read the book and have questions about the book, feel free to get those teed up. Ken will be walking around with a mic, and we do that. We can all hear each other, but for the recording that we're doing, and we'll share with the portfolio later. That way we don't have to repeat the questions. Anything else before we jump in, or shall we get started?
We can get started. Before we get going, I'm assuming most of you haven't read it, because then I can kind of go into some details about what's in it without feeling like I'm being repetitive. Is that okay? Okay, good. Fire away.
Alrighty. Well, thanks everybody for coming. My name is Rick Klau. I'm a partner at Google Ventures. One of the things we're trying out this year, we're going to do more of, are bringing authors in to talk about their book, either the industry that they cover. In a couple of months, we've got a novelist coming who's got a science fiction novel coming out, who's going to talk about the space that he writes about. But very excited to kick this off with Fred, who's written a great book. I took some time over the holidays to read through it. Kind of fascinating when you read a book when you're familiar with about half of the story, right? So for those who haven't read the book, what Dogfight talks about is the inside story of the development of both iOS and the iPhone and Android, both as a platform and eventually as a series of devices, and talks about how earth-shaking
TV and baseball and sporting events and other kinds of things. What I came to start to realize was that this really wasn't just a fight about who was going to be king of the hill in high tech, but that this was actually the whole convergence revolution that we'd been talking about for the past 30 years actually starting to happen. That up until then, the devices that actually existed to drive convergence really weren't very good, and that for the first time, actually, we had devices where essentially you could turn the analog world into a series of hyperlinks. So, you see something, you're on the bus and you see a billboard for movie X, and all of a sudden you could watch it on your iPhone or your Android phone. And so you added all those things together, and I thought that putting a box around that would be a pretty good way to sort of give people a sense of what was happening right now, but also where the future was going. And so I'm trying to think and then as I kind of dug into it, what I started to come to understand was that there was an even greater purpose to all of this, which is that people don't really understand Silicon Valley at all, even today. And I would say people outside of Silicon Valley look at companies like Google and Apple and Facebook and all the very big companies here with a fair amount of awe and suspicion. To me, that not only was there going to be a pretty good competition between the two, but that the friendship that Google and Apple had was going to pretty quickly deteriorate. I think that, and so I took a look at that and thought, well, there's probably a really good story in there. Usually when you get two big companies going at it like that. There's a pretty good backstory, but it was more. There was more to it than that. What I started to really realize was that we were witnessing was essentially the PC revolution all over again. That what happened in the early 1980s was essentially replaying itself once again, that we were actually going to have a platform war the way Apple and Microsoft had in the 1980s, and that fight was going to go on for quite some time. And so I thought that there were a lot of different threads just in there that would pull, that were more than a magazine piece could tackle. And then what I started to realize was, as I was using my phone, I started to realize this after the tablet came out, but as I started to use my phone and my tablet to watch,
Those two developments were how they both influenced each other in some unpredictable ways. And having been at Google for most of the time that Android grew up and then was launched, really fascinating when you see people's names who you used to share office space with, or in the case of Wes Chan, who sits upstairs. So really looking forward to hearing more color from Fred about the book. I've got some questions teed up. Looking forward to hearing questions from those of you in the audience. And really just looking forward to a pretty colorful conversation. So Fred, why don't you start out, this is a space you've covered for a long time. What led you to this as the focal point for the book? And what are some of the key themes that you tease out throughout the story?
well, thanks for coming, guys. I spent a fair amount of time thinking about, well, let me back up. The book grew out of stories I wrote for Wired in 2008 and 2009 and 2010. It was pretty obvious when the iPhone came out that it was going to be a big deal. Not just because it was a gadget, but because that Steve Jobs had come out with, but because it was very quickly obvious that it was the first pocket computer the first computer that fit in your pocket that actually you'd want to buy. And once, and then when Android came out, it was pretty obvious, maybe at least